Pine cleaner and old money. That's what arrogance smells like when you scrub it off a marble floor for minimum wage. Nadia knew the stains on the Costa estate weren't just spilled wine, but she kept her head down and her sponge moving. She was invisible, a fixture, until Darian Costa, a man with too much power and a vicious sense of humor, needed a prop to insult the city's elite. He invited his maid to the gala as a punchline. He didn't expect her to ruin him. The grout in the grand foyer of the Costa estate was a shade of pale bone, and it took a toothbrush to get the grime out of it. Nadia knelt on a folded towel, the damp cold of the stone seeping through the thin fabric of her uniform pants, settling deep into her joints. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache. She dragged the bristles along the narrow trench between the tiles, the harsh chemical tang of bleach burning the back of her throat. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays meant the downstairs floors, the heavy velvet drapes in the dining room, and ignoring the hushed, frantic arguments of men in tailored suits who walked through the hallways like they owned the oxygen. Nadia didn't care about the Mafia. She didn't care about the territory disputes, the shipments off the docks, or the body count that the local news hinted at, but never confirmed. She cared about the utility bill sitting on her cramped kitchen counter and the creeping mold in her apartment bathroom. Darian Costa's criminal enterprise was simply the entity that signed her meager paychecks. To her, Darian wasn't a ruthless underboss. He was just the guy who tracked mud onto the carpet she had vacuumed 10 minutes prior. Footsteps echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Not the scuffing, hurried steps of the low-level enforcers, but slow, deliberate strikes of leather against wood. Darian. Nadia didn't look up. She kept her rhythm. Scrub, wipe, rinse. Make sure you get the edges by the baseboards. His voice was a low rasp, rough like sandpaper over wood, carrying the faint scent of black coffee and stale cigarette smoke. Nadia paused, her gloved hands hovering over the soapy water in her yellow bucket. She kept her eyes on his shoes. Polished Oxfords, hand-stitched. They probably cost more than her rent for the year. "I always do, Mr. Costa," she said, her voice flat, neutral, invisible. Darian didn't move past her. He stood there, a towering mass of tension wrapped in a charcoal suit. He let out a sharp, irritated breath, pulling a heavy silver phone from his pocket and checking a message. He typed something out, his thumb, hitting the screen with unnecessary force. "Pendleton is a pompous piece of shit," Darian muttered almost to himself. Nadia resumed scrubbing. It wasn't her place to agree or disagree with the boss's assessment of rival crime families or high society politicians. She was the help. He thinks because his money is a century older than mine, he can dictate seating arrangements at the charity gala. Darian pocketed the phone. He looked down at Nadia. She could feel the weight of his stare pressing into the back of her neck. He requested I bring a guest of suitable pedigree, meaning he wants me to parade around some vapid heiress so he can feel comfortable having a thug in his ballroom. "Sounds complicated," Nadia offered weakly, wanting nothing more than for him to walk away so she could finish the hallway. Silence stretched. The grandfather clock in the study ticked. "Stand up." Nadia's stomach gave a sharp, unpleasant lurch. She dropped the toothbrush into the bucket water, splashing against her wrists. She peeled off her yellow rubber gloves, her hands damp and smelling of synthetic lemon, and pushed herself up. Her knees popped. She wiped her hands on her apron and finally looked at him. Darian Costa had a face built for violence. Sharp jaw, a slightly crooked nose that had been broken and poorly set years ago, and eyes the color of dirty ice. He was looking at her not as a woman, but as an object. A chess piece. "What's your name again?" he asked. "Nadia." "Nadia." He tested the syllables. He looked at her drab grey uniform, her hair pulled back into a messy flyaway bun, the dark circles under her eyes, and the lack of makeup on her pale skin. A slow, cruel smile hitched the corner of his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. "You busy tomorrow night, Nadia?" She blinked. "I have the evening shift at the diner, sir. Call in sick. I'll cover whatever you make in tips triplet." Darian took a step closer. He smelled of expensive cologne, something woody and sharp, masking the faint metallic tang of a pistol carried close to the body. "You're coming to the Pendleton Gala with me." Nadia stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the statement short-circuited her brain for a second. "I don't understand." "It's simple," Darian said, his tone dripping with a cynical satisfaction. "Arthur Pendleton wants high society. I'm going to bring the woman who scrubs my toilets. I'm going to sit you at his table, let him make small talk with you, and then right before dessert, I'm going to tell him exactly who you are." He let out a low, humorless laugh. The look on his face will be worth $1 million. It was a joke. She was the punchline. A hot flush of humiliation crept up Nadia's neck. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her chipped nails digging into her palms. She wanted to tell him to go to hell. She wanted to throw the bucket of dirty water over his custom suit. But then she thought of the eviction notice taped to her neighbor's door. The way the heating in her building had been out for a week. Triple her diner wages meant groceries. It meant a new winter coat. She swallowed the bile in her throat. She locked her jaw. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away the subservient maid persona. Darian seemed mildly surprised by her lack of resistance, but he recovered quickly. "Just stand there. Look pretty. Keep your mouth shut unless spoken to. My assistant will send a car and a dress to your place tomorrow at 5. He turned on his heel, already dismissing her. "Don't be late, Nadia." "I hate waiting." Nadia watched him walk away. She looked down at her rough, calloused hands, the skin peeling around her cuticles. A punchline. Fine. She would be his joke. But she was going to make sure he paid every damn cent he promised. The garment bag was heavier than it looked. It hung on the back of Nadia's hollow core bedroom door, a sleek black phantom in a room filled with mismatched thrift store furniture and the smell of stale radiator heat. It was 5:30. The sun had already dipped below the city skyline, casting long grey shadows across her cracked linoleum floor. Nadia unzipped the bag. The fabric spilled out like liquid night. It was a gown dark as a bruised plum made of heavy silk that felt cold and slippery against her rough fingertips. It wasn't covered in sequins or cheap lace. It was structurally complex, relying on the drape and the cut to make an impact. A low cowl back, a severe neckline. It looked like armor pretending to be lingerie. At the bottom of the bag sat a rectangular black box. Inside a pair of black stilettos with a sole so thin they looked dangerous. "Arsehole," Nadia muttered to the empty room. Darian hadn't just sent a dress. He had sent a costume designed to make her feel entirely out of place. He wanted her to look like she was playing dress-up. She stepped into her bathroom, the fluorescent light flickering overhead and buzzing like an angry wasp. She turned on the shower, letting the water run until it turned lukewarm, the best this building could offer. She scrubbed herself raw with a cheap bar of soap, trying to get the lingering smell of the Costa Estate's lemon pledge out of her pores. She washed her hair, letting the suds run down the drain, watching the dirt of her daily life wash away. Stepping out, she dried off with a towel that was more thread than terry cloth. She sat on the edge of her mattress and began the painstaking process of applying the meager makeup she owned. A foundation that was half a shade too light. A mascara tube she had to run under hot water to get the last clumps out. a deep, dark red lipstick she had bought for a funeral 2 years ago. She pulled her hair back. Not the messy bun of the Maid, but a severe, slicked-back knot at the base of her neck. It pulled the skin of her face tight, emphasizing the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the hollowness beneath them. Then came the dress. Nadia stepped into the pool of silk. She pulled it up over her hips, holding her breath as she reached back to pull the hidden zipper. It slid up with a soft, metallic whisper. She turned to the cheap warped mirror bolted to the back of her closet door. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. The dress clung to her ribs, highlighting the fact that she skipped lunch most days. But it didn't look pitiful. The dark plum color leached the sickly pallor from her skin, replacing it with a stark, striking porcelain contrast. The back was entirely exposed, a sweeping expanse of skin down to the base of her spine. But her hands ruined the illusion. Her knuckles were red. Her fingernails were short, unpainted, the skin around them chewed and ragged. The hands of a worker. She curled them into tight fists, hiding the evidence, and slipped her feet into the stilettos. They pinched instantly. A horn honked outside. 2 short, sharp blasts. Nadia grabbed a worn black trench coat, the only coat she owned, and walked out, locking the deadbolt behind her. The street was dark, the air biting cold. A massive black town car idled at the curb, its exhaust pluming in the freezing air. The back door opened as she approached. She slid into the cavernous back seat. It smelled intensely of new leather and Darian's sharp cologne. He was sitting in the far corner, a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, the ice clinking softly as the car shifted into gear. He was wearing a tuxedo. The stark black and white made him look harder, more angular, less human. He didn't look at her as she settled into the seat, pulling her cheap coat tight around her shoulders. "You're late," he said to the window. "Your driver got lost." She lied, her voice steady. Darian finally turned his head. His eyes dragged over her. She saw the exact moment his brain registered the visual information. The sneer he had prepared faltered for a fraction of a second. His gaze dropped to the exposed curve of her neck, down to the sliver of dark silk, visible beneath the ratty trench coat. He frowned, a tiny crease appearing between his brows, as if a piece of a puzzle didn't fit. "Take the coat off," he ordered. "It's cold." "I don't care. Take it off. I need to make sure the fit is right. I won't have Pendleton laughing at me for bringing someone in poorly tailored clothes." Nadia's jaw clenched. Slowly she shrugged the trench coat off her shoulders, letting it pool in her lap. The interior lights of the car washed over the dark plum silk. Darian stared. The silence in the car grew thick, heavy enough to choke on. The ice in his glass stopped clinking. His eyes tracked from the sharp cut of the neckline up to her severe hair and finally to her face. He was looking for the scared, submissive Maid. He was looking for the punchline. Instead, Nadia looked back at him, with a gaze as dead and cold as the winter outside. She didn't fidget. She didn't shrink. She just sat there, encased in his expensive silk, radiating a quiet, venomous hostility. Darian swallowed. He looked away, clearing his throat, his grip tightening on his glass. "It will do," he muttered, though his voice lacked the biting edge it had in the hallway yesterday. The rest of the ride was spent in suffocating silence. The streetlights flickered across Darian's face in rhythmic pulses. Nadia stared straight ahead, focusing on the pain in her toes to keep her heart rate down. She was terrified. She was walking into a room full of monsters holding the leash of the biggest one. But she wouldn't let him see her sweat. The Pendleton estate was a fortress of limestone and arrogance, situated on the edge of the city's most expensive district. The driveway was a sweeping arc, lined with imported winter pines, currently choked with a parade of Bentleys, Maybachs, and armored SUVs. When their town car finally jerked to a halt beneath the massive portico, Nadia felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. The noise hit her before the doors even opened. The dull roar of hundreds of conversations, the clatter of valet keys, the sharp, rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters from a designated press pen near the entrance. Darian tossed back the rest of his drink. He adjusted his cuffs, his face settling into a mask of pure, predatory boredom. The door was pulled open by a valet in a uniform nicer than Nadia's best clothes. The freezing night air rushed into the heated cabin, biting at her exposed skin. "Out!" Darian grunted, stepping out onto the cobblestones. Nadia took a breath that tasted like exhaust and expensive perfume. She left her trench coat on the seat. She swung her legs out the stilettos, finding unsteady purchase on the stone, and pushed herself up. The cameras flashed a blinding barrage of white light. They didn't know who she was, but she was stepping out of Darian Costa's car, which meant she was meat for the society pages. Nadia flinched, bringing a hand up to shield her eyes, the instinct of someone used to hiding in the background. A heavy hand clamped down on her lower back. Darian's palm was burning hot against the bare skin of her spine. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a brand. Ownership. He leaned in close, his mouth brushing the shell of her ear. "Don't cover your face," he hissed, his voice, a low vibration she felt in her chest. "Walk straight. Look at them like they owe you money." Nadia dropped her hand. She stiffened, reacting to the command and the sheer invasive heat of his touch. She didn't know how to look like money, but she knew how to look like she was thoroughly done with everyone's bullshit. She channeled every ounce of exhaustion, every aching muscle from scrubbing his floors, every bit of resentment she held for this man and this city into her posture. She pulled her shoulders back. She lifted her chin. She let her eyes go flat, sweeping over the paparazzi and the gawking valets with utter disinterest. Darian's hand shifted slightly on her back, a subtle flex of his fingers against her bare spine. He guided her forward, matching his long strides to her stiletto-hobbled steps. They walked up the wide marble stairs. The heavy brass doors were held open by two massive security guards. As they crossed the threshold, the sheer scale of the gala hit Nadia like a physical blow. The ballroom was cavernous, draped in gold and ivory. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, buttery light over the crowd. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, heavy floral centerpieces, and the sharp tang of expensive gin. It was a sea of velvet diamonds and tailored tuxedos, and the moment Darian Costa stepped into the room, a ripple of awareness moved through the crowd. Conversations died, heads turned, glasses were lowered. Nadia felt the weight of hundreds of eyes shifting from Darian to her. The scrutiny was microscopic. They were cataloguing her dress, analyzing her lack of jewelry, dissecting her severe hair. She felt naked. She wanted to bolt for the catering exit. She knew had to be in the back. But Darian's hand remained anchored to her back, an immovable force. "Smile," he murmured. "I'm not an actress," she muttered back through her teeth, barely moving her lips. "Just don't look like you're about to throw up." A man separated himself from the crowd and began walking toward them. He was older, distinguished with silver hair, perfectly coiffed, and a tuxedo that looked like it had been sewn onto his body. His smile was wide, bright, and entirely fake. "Arthur Pendleton." "Darian," Arthur boomed his voice, carrying an affected mid-Atlantic accent. "I wasn't sure you'd actually brave civilized society tonight." "Arthur," Darian replied, his tone smooth, dangerous. "I wouldn't miss it. You know I love a good zoo." Arthur's smile tightened slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. His gaze shifted immediately to Nadia. He looked her up and down, a practiced, assessing sweep. He was looking for the tell. He was waiting for her to stumble, to giggle nervously, to reveal herself as cheap arm candy. "And who is this?" Arthur asked, his tone dripping with condescending charm. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I know almost everyone in the city but your face. It's quite new." Darian opened his mouth. This was the moment. This was where he delivered the punchline. This was where he told the billionaire host that his esteemed guest was the woman who unclogged the Costa estate's drains. Nadia felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She braced herself for the humiliation. But as Darian looked down at her, the words died in his throat. He saw her standing there under the blinding crystal chandeliers, the dark plum silk clinging to her, moving like liquid shadows, the severe hair emphasizing a face that wasn't classically pretty, but was arresting in its sharp, unforgiving structure. He saw the way she was looking at Arthur Pendleton, not with awe, not with fear, but with a cold, hollow detachment that mirrored the very aristocrats Arthur worshipped. She didn't look like a joke. She looked untouchable. Darian's jaw tightened. A strange, completely foreign sensation seized his chest, a territorial spike. The idea of degrading her in front of Pendleton suddenly left a foul taste in his mouth. "This," Darian said, his voice dropping, rougher than before. His hand slid from her back to grip her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Is Nadia?" Arthur waited for a last name, a pedigree, a title. Darian offered nothing else. He just stared Arthur down, daring him to push. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at Nadia again, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his polished features. "Well," Arthur said smoothly, recovering his poise. "A pleasure, Nadia. I hope Darian isn't boring you too much with his business talk." "Mr. Costa rarely talks," Nadia said, her voice surprisingly steady, the flat cadence of her usual speech sounding intentionally deadpan in this environment. "He mostly just glares." A few people standing nearby, who had been eavesdropping, let out startled, muffled laughs. Arthur blinked, caught off guard by the dry, unimpressed delivery. Darian froze. He looked down at her genuine shock breaking through his stoic mask. Nadia didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Arthur, projecting the same exhausted indifference she felt while scrubbing the grout. To the high society crowd, it didn't look like fatigue. It looked like devastating, effortless power. She had just insulted the most feared man in the room to his face, and she hadn't even blinked. The dynamic shifted violently. The joke was dead. The punchline had vanished. Darian Costa pulled his maid closer to his side, his thumb digging into the silk at her waist, realizing with a sudden sharp clarity that he had brought a lit match into a room full of gasoline. The pain in Nadia's feet shifted from a dull ache to a sharp, rhythmic stabbing, syncing perfectly with the heavy thud of the bass from the string quartet playing a modern pop song in the corner. The stilettos were torture devices. Every step felt like driving a glass shard into her heel, but she didn't limp. Limping meant weakness, and in the 2 hours she had been circulating this ballroom with Darian Costa's hand clamped to her waist, Nadia had learned one absolute truth about high society. They were identical to the feral cats fighting over scraps behind her apartment building. If you showed a soft underbelly, they gutted you. "Keep moving," Darian murmured against her hair. The scent of his cologne, cedar and pepper was practically baked into her sinuses by now. "If I keep moving, I'm going to bleed on your shoes." She replied, her voice a flat murmur that barely carried over the clinking of champagne flutes. Darian's fingers twitched against the silk covering her hip. He didn't offer a reprieve, but his stride shortened by a fraction of an inch. A microscopic concession. He was off balance, and Nadia could feel it radiating off him. He had walked into this gala expecting a circus act. He wanted to parade his working-class Maid in front of the city's aristocrats, pull the rug out from under them, and laugh at their outrage. But Nadia had hijacked the joke. Her sheer exhausted apathy was being misread by every billionaire and socialite in the room as ultimate untouchable exclusivity. A woman in a sequined emerald gown intercepted them. She smelled overpoweringly of jasmine and gin. Her eyes were sharp, darting over Nadia's unadorned neck and the stark, severe lines of the plum dress. "Darian, darling," the woman purred, touching his forearm with manicured claws. "You've been hiding her. Who is this creature?" "Beatrice." Darian said, his tone perfectly neutral. "This is Nadia." Beatrice waited. Just like Arthur Pendleton had. When no pedigree was offered, her smile turned brittle. Just Nadia. How aggressively modern. "Tell me, darling, what do you do?" "Philanthropy, arts, curation." Nadia looked at Beatrice. She looked at the diamond tennis bracelet on the woman's wrist, easily worth enough to buy Nadia's apartment building and burn it to the ground for warmth. A hollow emptiness gnawed at Nadia's stomach. She hadn't eaten since 6 that morning, a heel of stale bread and black tea. The smell of roasted meats and rich truffle oil drifting from the catering doors was making the edges of her vision blur. "I manage waste," Nadia said. Beatrice blinked, her heavy false eyelashes fluttering. "Waste, you mean corporate acquisitions, trimming the fat off failing conglomerates." "Something like that," Nadia said, her eyes dropping back to the floor. "I scrub out the things people want to pretend aren't there." Beatrice let out a high, breathy laugh, completely misinterpreting the grim reality of the statement as a witty metaphor. "Oh, she's brutal, Darian. I like her. She has that dead-eyed European chic. Very avant-garde." Darian didn't laugh. The hand on Nadia's waist tightened, pulling her so flush against him she could feel the hard line of his holster through his tuxedo jacket. "Excuse us, Beatrice," Darian said, his voice dropping an octave. "We need to find our table." He steered her away, his grip borderline bruising. When they were out of earshot, he leaned down. "Manage waste," he hissed the words vibrating against her temple. "Are you trying to get me laughed out of this room?" I answered her question, Nadia said, refusing to look up at him. "I didn't lie. If these idiots want to wrap my life in a bow and call it avant-garde, that's their problem, not mine." Darian stopped walking. He pulled her into a small alcove between 2 massive marble pillars, shielding them from the bulk of the crowd. The shadow of the pillar fell over his face, making the sharp angles of his jaw look like they were carved from stone. He stared at her. He was angry, yes. But beneath the anger was a turbulent, violent confusion. He looked at her pale skin, the dark circles under her eyes that the cheap makeup couldn't fully hide, the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, tight breaths. "You're shaking," he noted his voice, suddenly void of its usual biting sarcasm. "I'm starving," Nadia said bluntly. There was no point in lying. "I work on my feet for 10 hours a day, Mr. Costa. I clean your house. I work the diner grill. I don't eat caviar. I haven't had a meal today, and these shoes are taking skin off my heels. So excuse me if my performance isn't up to your standards." The words hung in the air, raw and ugly, a stark contrast to the glittering opulence surrounding them. Darian's eyes flicked down to her feet, then back up to her face. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, the armor cracked. He looked like a man who had just realized he was holding a live wire. He didn't apologize. Men like Darian Costa didn't know the word. But he released her waist. "Wait here," he ordered. He turned and walked into the crowd. Nadia sagged against the cool marble of the pillar, closing her eyes. She pressed the palms of her hands against the freezing stone, grounding herself. She just needed to survive the dinner. 2 minutes later, Darian returned. In his left hand, he held a small, heavy, crystal tumbler of water. In his right, a linen napkin wrapped around something warm. He shoved them into her hands. Nadia looked down. Inside the napkin were 3 thick, warm rolls of bread from a passing catering tray. "Eat," he said, looking away, scanning the crowd as if standing guard. "Quickly, before the chimes ring for dinner." Nadia didn't hesitate. She tore into the bread, the soft, buttery carbs hitting her empty stomach like a revelation. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank the water in one long, desperate gulp. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, a strictly blue-collar gesture that made Darian's jaw twitch. She balled up the linen napkin and held it out to him. He took it, tossing it casually onto a passing waiter's tray. "Better?" he asked, his tone rough. "Yes," she said. "Good." His hand returned to her waist, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin silk. "Don't embarrass me at the table." Table 1 was a circular slab of mahogany, positioned directly beneath the largest chandelier in the room. It was the epicenter of power in the city. Arthur Pendleton sat at the head, flanked by a state senator and a tech billionaire. Darian's name card placed him directly to Arthur's right. Nadia was seated beside Darian. The chair was heavy velvet. As she sat, the relief in her legs was so profound, she almost let out a pathetic whimper. But she locked her jaw, keeping her spine rigid. The table setting was a nightmare of silver. 4 forks to her left, 3 knives, and a spoon to her right. Above the plate, a dessert spoon and fork lay horizontally. A tiny knife rested on a bread plate. 5 different crystal glasses clustered by her right hand. Nadia stared at the arsenal of cutlery. A hot flush of panic began to crawl up her neck. She knew how to polish silver, not how to navigate it. If she picked up the wrong fork, the illusion would shatter. They would see the dirt under her fingernails, the cheap apartment, the eviction notice. The first course was served. A tiny seared scallop sitting in a pool of dark, oily sauce, topped with a dollop of black caviar. Conversation around the table ignited a rapid-fire exchange of stock portfolios, zoning permits and offshore accounts. Nadia kept her hands firmly in her lap, her knuckles white. She watched the senator's wife, waiting to see which fork she grabbed. Before she could track the movement, a heavy, warm presence leaned into her space. Darian didn't look at her. He was deep in conversation with Arthur, nodding slowly at something the older man said. But beneath the edge of the table, out of sight of the others, his left hand moved. His large, calloused fingers brushed against the back of her hand, resting in her lap. The touch was electric, jarring against her cold skin. He slid his hand up, finding her wrist, and gave it a brief, firm squeeze. Then, on the tabletop, he casually picked up the small, 3-pronged fork furthest to the outside left. He didn't use it. He just held it, tapping it softly against the linen tablecloth while he spoke to Arthur. The outside fork. Nadia swallowed hard. She reached out her hand, trembling just a fraction, and picked up her own outside fork. The dinner progressed in a grueling, tense rhythm. Every time a new course arrived, a strange, gelatinous soup, a slab of Wagyu beef the size of a matchbox, Darian subtly telegraphed the correct utensil. A tap of his knife, a shift of his spoon. He never broke his conversation with the billionaires. He never looked at her. It was a silent, bizarre choreography between a mob boss and his maid, hidden in plain sight. It felt like control, but it also felt terrifyingly like protection. By the time the main course plates were cleared, the wine had loosened tongues. The tech billionaire, a man named Conrad, with slicked-back hair and a cruel smile, leaned across the table, fixing his gaze on Nadia. So, Nadia. Conrad slurred slightly, swirling a glass of deep red Bordeaux. Beatrice tells me you're in the waste management business. Sounds incredibly grim. The table quieted. Arthur leaned back, watching with sharp, predatory eyes. Darian went entirely still beside her. It pays the bills, Nadia said, her voice flat. But where does one acquire a taste for such a brutal industry? Conrad pressed a mocking lilt in his voice. Darian won't tell us a damn thing about your background. Where did you study? What's your family name? You sit here looking like a queen holding court, but you haven't contributed a single thought to the conversation all night. The silence at the table thickened into cement. Darian's hand moved from the tabletop, dropping down to his lap. Nadia felt the sudden absence of his presence beside her, the shift in his posture, signaling violence. He was going to end it. He was going to stand up, flip the table, or deliver the punchline. Nadia didn't let him. She met Conrad's mocking stare. She didn't blink. She thought about the mold in her bathroom. She thought about the smell of bleach. She thought about how much she hated these people who played with human lives like poker chips. I don't contribute Conrad because I find your conversation incredibly boring, Nadia said. Someone at the table choked on their wine. Arthur's eyebrows shot to his hairline. Boring. Conrad bristled his face, flushing dark red. Yes, Nadia said, her voice steady cold and echoing with the exhaustion of 100 double shifts. You talk about money like it's a game. You talk about zoning permits that will displace hundreds of families like it's a chess move. You ask about my pedigree because you need to put me in a box so you can decide if I'm worth your respect. She picked up her wine glass by the stem. Her chipped nail polish was suddenly visible in the harsh chandelier light. But she didn't hide it. I grew up on the east side. Nadia continued the truth, slipping out like a blade. I learned my trade on my hands and knees, scrubbing up messes made by men exactly like you. Men who think wealth makes them immortal. She took a slow sip of the wine. It tasted like ash and berries. I don't have a family name that matters, but I know exactly what you all look like when the lights go out. She set the glass down. The click of the crystal against the table sounded like a gunshot. Conrad opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Arthur Pendleton stared at her, an unreadable expression freezing his features. Darian Costa slowly picked up his scotch. He took a long, deliberate swallow. When he lowered the glass, he looked at Nadia. The anger was gone. The confusion was gone. In its place was a dark, consuming fire. The string quartet transitioned into a slow, melancholic waltz, signaling the end of the dinner service. Guests began to push their chairs back, migrating toward the dance floor or the open bars lining the walls. Nadia didn't wait to see if Conrad would recover his voice. She stood up. The sudden movement sent a spike of white-hot agony shooting up her calves from the stilettos. She didn't care. The air in the ballroom was suffocating, thick with the smell of roasted meat, expensive perfumes, and bruised egos. I need some air, she muttered to nobody in particular. She turned and walked away from table 1. She didn't look back to see if Darian followed. She just needed to be out of the heat, out of the light. She navigated the edge of the room, keeping her face blank, ignoring the stares and whispers that trailed in her wake. She found a set of heavy glass doors partially obscured by velvet drapes. She pushed through them, stepping out onto a sweeping stone terrace. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The winter air was biting, smelling of distant car exhaust and the metallic promise of snow. It was a brutal shock to her bare back, but it cleared the fog from her head. The terrace was empty. She walked to the stone balustrade, leaning heavily against it. Below her, the city sprawled in a grid of amber streetlights and crawling headlights. Nadia gripped the stone, her knuckles turning white. She had broken the rules. She had insulted a billionaire. She had likely cost Darian Costa whatever alliance he was trying to build with Pendleton. He was going to kill her, or worse, fire her. She let out a ragged breath that plumed into the freezing air. Slowly, painfully, she reached down. She unbuckled the thin, vicious strap of the left stiletto. She pulled it off. The relief was so absolute she nearly sobbed. She took off the right one. She stood barefoot on the freezing limestone flags. The cold seeped up through the soles of her feet, numbing the blisters and the aching arches. It was a sharp, grounding pain. Real pain. Not the manufactured discomfort of a silk dress and high heels. The heavy glass door clicked open behind her. The scent of cedar and sharp tobacco hit the air. Nadia didn't turn around. She dropped the stilettos onto the stone. "You can fire me tomorrow," she said to the city lights, wrapping her arms around her ribs in a vain attempt to stay warm. "Or you can tell your driver to leave me here. I'll walk home." Footsteps approached, slow, measured, leather against stone. Darian stopped right beside her. He didn't speak. He pulled a silver lighter from his tuxedo pocket and a crushed pack of cigarettes. The lighter clicked the flame, casting a harsh orange glow over his rugged profile. He took a drag, the cherry burning bright in the darkness. "Pendleton just asked me if I plan on marrying you," Darian said, quietly, exhaling a plume of white smoke. Nadia turned her head. She stared at him, incredulous. "What? Conrad thinks you're an undercover federal agent," Darian continued, his voice devoid of humor, "and Beatrice is currently telling anyone who will listen that you are the exiled bastard daughter of a Russian oligarch." He turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, in the shadows of the terrace. "You tore them to shreds, Nadia. You looked at a table full of men who could destroy your life with a phone call, and you looked bored doing it." "I was angry," Nadia snapped, her teeth beginning to chatter from the cold. "They treat people like dirt." "So do I." "Yes," she said, holding his gaze. "You do." Darian flinched. It was a microscopic movement, but Nadia caught it. He looked down. He looked at the discarded stilettos. Then his eyes traced the line of her bare legs, down to her feet, planted firmly on the freezing stone. He noticed the blood. A small dark smear on her heel where the shoe had rubbed the skin raw. He swore softly under his breath. He took one last drag of the cigarette and flicked it over the balcony. Without a word, he took off his custom tuxedo jacket. He stepped behind her and draped the heavy wool over her shoulders. The jacket retained the heat of his body. It was massive on her, engulfing her upper half, smelling intensely of him. Nadia stiffened, confused by the gesture. Darian didn't step back. He stood close behind her, his hands resting lightly on the shoulders of the jacket, trapping her between his chest and the stone balustrade. "Why didn't you do it?" Nadia asked, the words forced out through her chattering teeth. "Why didn't you tell them I was your maid? That was the whole point of this. The punchline." Darian stared out at the city. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint, muffled thumping of the bass from inside the ballroom. "Because," Darian said slowly, his voice dropping to a low, raw rasp. "I realized halfway through the night that the joke was on me." He stepped closer, the space between them vanishing. He reached down his large hand, gently taking one of hers. He didn't look at the city anymore. He looked at her hand, at the short, unpainted nails, at the rough calluses on her palms from gripping the mop handle, at the redness around her knuckles from the bleach. He ran his thumb over the callus on her index finger. The contrast was staggering, his immaculate manicured hands, clean except for the blood he washed off in private, and her rough, battered hands stained by the honest, brutal labor of keeping his world clean. "They don't deserve the truth about you," Darian murmured, his thumb still tracing the rough skin of her palm. "You're the only real thing in that room." Nadia's breath hitched. The cold had vanished, replaced by a suffocating, dangerous heat. This wasn't the script. He was a monster, and she was the help. But standing in the freezing dark, draped in his coat, holding his hand, the lines were blurring into something terrifying. Darian slowly turned her hand over his eyes, lifting from her knuckles to meet hers. The look in his eyes wasn't a joke anymore. It was a hunger deeper and far more dangerous than anything she had felt all night. Nadia pulled her hand away. She didn't snatch it back like a frightened animal, but withdrew it with deliberate, even force. She didn't trust the heat in his eyes. In her world, heat was just another word for getting burned. Darian let her go without resistance, his hand falling back to his side. The sudden absence of his touch left her skin acutely aware of the freezing air. She pulled his heavy wool tuxedo jacket tighter around her chest, the cedar and tobacco scent of him wrapping around her throat. "We're leaving," Darian said. He didn't ask. He didn't suggest. He turned toward the heavy glass doors, pulling a sleek two-way radio from his inner pocket. "Leo, bring the car to the South Service exit. 2 minutes." He didn't make her walk back through the ballroom. He didn't subject her to the predatory stares of Pendleton's guests or the blinding flash of the press pit. Instead, he led her down a narrow, unlit flight of stone stairs reserved for the catering staff. Nadia carried the vicious stilettos in one hand, her bare feet slapping quietly against the freezing concrete. The grit and dirt of the utility stairwell stuck to her soles. It felt infinitely more familiar than the Persian rugs upstairs. The town car was idling in the alleyway, exhaust pluming white in the dark. Leo, a broad-shouldered driver with a scarred neck, had the back door open before they even cleared the shadows. Nadia slid into the back seat. The heater was blasting the sudden rush of warm air, making her shiver violently as her body desperately tried to regulate its temperature. Darian got in beside her. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the city noise, sealing them in a soundproof leather vault. "The estate boss?" Leo asked, his eyes catching Darian's in the rearview mirror. "No," Darian said, his voice exhausted. "The downtown penthouse." Nadia's head snapped toward him. "My apartment is on 43rd. "Your apartment has no heat, Nadia," Darian said, leaning his head back against the leather headrest and closing his eyes. "You told me yesterday the radiator was dead. You're half frozen. You haven't eaten a real meal, and your feet are bleeding. You are not going back to a freezing box tonight. I am not your charity case." She snapped, the adrenaline of the evening souring into defensive anger. "You paid me for a job. The job is done. I was the punchline. Then I ruined your dinner. We're even." Darian opened his eyes and rolled his head to the side to look at her. The streetlights outside strobed across his face, highlighting the exhaustion carved into the lines around his mouth. "The job isn't done until I say it's done. And right now, I say you need iodine and a mattress that doesn't feel like a slab of concrete. Sit back and be quiet," she wanted to argue. She opened her mouth, the biting retort ready on her tongue. But a wave of profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over her. Her shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of her, leaving only the dull throb of her abused feet and the hollow ache in her stomach. She turned her face to the tinted window, watching the blur of neon lights, and let the silence take over. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended 60 floors above the city grid. It didn't smell like lemon polish and old money. It smelled like nothing. Clean, filtered air and expensive emptiness. Darian bypassed the massive living room, steering her directly down a wide hallway, illuminated by soft, recessed lighting. He pushed open the door to a guest bathroom that was larger than her entire apartment. The floor was heated marble. "Sit!" He pointed to the edge of the sunken garden tub. Nadia sat. She was too tired to put up the facade of defiance. She dropped the stilettos onto the floor, the thud echoing off the glass walls. Darian didn't call for a maid. He didn't call for staff. He stripped off his holster, placing the heavy black firearm on the granite vanity. Then he rolled up the crisp white sleeves of his dress shirt, exposing thick forearms, corded with muscle and faded ink. He opened a cabinet, retrieving a white first aid box and a thick cotton towel. He walked over to her, and then the man who dictated the criminal heartbeat of the eastern seaboard dropped to his knees on the bathroom floor. Nadia stiffened her breath, catching in her throat. "Mr. Costa, you don't—" "Quiet." He took her left foot in his large, warm hands. His touch was clinical, yet startlingly gentle. He turned her heel toward the light. The blister had popped the skin, rubbed entirely raw by the cheap, unforgiving leather of the heel, leaving an angry, bleeding welt. He wet a washcloth with warm water and soap. "This is going to sting." He didn't wait for her to brace herself. He pressed the damp cloth against the raw skin. Nadia hissed her toes, curling involuntarily, her hands gripping the edge of the tub. Darian's thumb stroked the arch of her foot, a steadying, unconscious gesture that sent a jolt of heat straight up her leg. "Conrad and his friends," Darian said, quietly, his voice echoing off the marble as he worked. "They build their empires on paper. Stocks, bonds, promises. They don't know what it costs to actually build something from the dirt." He tossed the bloody washcloth into the sink and opened a small brown bottle of iodine. He soaked a cotton pad. "You build an empire from the dirt you learn to respect the people who have to dig in it," he muttered. He pressed the iodine to the wound. Nadia flinched hard, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Darian paused, his hand tightening slightly on her ankle to keep her from pulling away. He looked up, his pale, dirty ice eyes locking onto hers. The physical proximity was suffocating. She was looking down at him, but she had never felt more thoroughly dismantled. "You were magnificent tonight, Nadia." He said the words, stripped of all his usual sarcasm, raw and entirely genuine. You bled them dry without raising your voice. He taped a thick, sterile bandage over her heel, his fingers lingering on her skin for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then he moved to her other foot. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, fighting the strange tightness in her chest. "I know," he replied, finishing the second bandage. He sat back on his heels, looking at her battered, calloused hands resting on her lap, then up to the sharp, exhausted lines of her face. That's what made it beautiful. Nadia woke to the smell of strong black coffee and the sound of falling rain. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was impossibly high, painted a matte, stormy grey. The sheets tangling around her legs were silk, heavy and cool against her skin. It took her brain several agonizing seconds to boot up to sort through the fragmented memories of the night before the freezing terrace, the smell of cedar Darian Costa, kneeling on the bathroom floor. She sat up. Her head pounded a dull rhythmic ache from the cheap wine and the severe crash of adrenaline. She was wearing one of Darian's dark grey t-shirts. She vaguely remembered him tossing it to her before pointing her toward this bedroom, telling her to lock the door if it made her feel better. She hadn't. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her feet hit the plush rug. The bandages on her heels pulled tight, but the sharp, stabbing pain of the stilettos was gone. Nadia walked out of the bedroom, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. The penthouse was wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a city drowned in a torrential morning downpour. The sky was the color of a bruised iron pan. Darian was in the kitchen. He was still wearing the tuxedo trousers from last night, but he had swapped the dress shirt for a black thermal Henley that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He stood at the marble island, a phone pressed to his ear, a steaming mug of coffee in his free hand. He didn't look like a man who had hosted a charity gala. He looked like a man preparing for a war. Nadia stopped at the edge of the hallway, hovering in the shadow, not wanting to intrude. But Darian's voice carried deep and resonant in the quiet apartment. "I don't give a damn about the optics, Arthur," Darian growled into the phone. "Conrad disrespected a guest at my table. In my world, that requires teeth. In yours, apparently, it requires an apology. We have a fundamental incompatibility." A pause. Nadia could hear the faint, tinny squawk of Pendleton's frantic voice through the receiver. Darian took a slow sip of his coffee. His eyes flicked up, catching Nadia standing in the hallway. He didn't look away. His gaze locked onto hers, burning right through the oversized t-shirt, through the exhaustion, straight to the core of her. "No, Arthur, you listen to me," Darian said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on Nadia's arms stand up. It was the voice of the underboss, the predator. "I am pulling my backing from Conrad's waterfront development project, effective immediately. I'm liquidating my shares in his holding company by noon. By the time the market closes today, his stock is going to drop so fast he'll be feeling the G-force in his teeth." Another frantic, louder squawk from the phone. Pendleton was panicking. "If that exposes your political action committee, Arthur, then you better start finding some new donors," Darian continued, absolutely ruthless. "You wanted my money because it's heavy, but you forgot that heavy things sink. Tell Conrad he can go back to begging the banks. We're done." Darian ended the call. He tossed the silver phone onto the marble counter. The clatter echoed sharply. He looked at Nadia. She stepped into the light of the kitchen. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly, intensely aware of her bare legs and the messy, unkempt state of her hair. "You just tanked a multi-million-dollar real estate deal," she said, her voice rough from sleep. "I just bankrupted a parasite," Darian corrected, pouring a second mug of coffee from the glass carafe. He pushed it across the marble island toward her. "Conrad overleveraged his assets, thinking he had my capital to cushion his fall. He doesn't. By tomorrow, he'll be selling his wife's jewelry to make payroll." Nadia walked slowly to the island. She picked up the mug. The porcelain was warm against her cold palms. She took a sip. It was black, bitter, and exactly what she needed. "Why?" she asked, looking at him over the rim of the cup. "You brought me there to humiliate them. You were going to use me as a prop to prove a point. Now you're blowing up your own business interests because a snob insulted me. It doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense," Darian said. He leaned his forearms on the counter, closing the distance between them. "I brought a maid to a gala to mock them. But the woman sitting at that table wasn't a maid. You looked at Conrad like he was nothing. You looked at a room full of power and saw straight through the rot. You did in 5 minutes what I've been trying to do to these aristocrats for 5 years. You made them bleed." He reached out his thick fingers, lightly tracing the rim of her coffee mug, stopping a fraction of an inch from her knuckles. "They construct these elaborate games, these mazes of etiquette and wealth, to make themselves untouchable," Darian said quietly. "And you just took a sledgehammer to the glass. You don't care about their rules, Nadia. You're real. You survive. And I suddenly realized I'd rather lose a $10 million deal than let a cheap suit Disrespect, the only genuine thing I've encountered in a decade. Nadia stared at him. The sheer gravity of what he had done, the brutal, uncompromising karma he had just delivered to a man who thought he owned the world, settled heavily in the room. It wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. It was violent, calculated, and terrifyingly protective. "So," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Conrad loses his waterfront, Pendleton loses his funding. And they learn," Darian finished, his eyes darkening, "that the help occasionally bites back." The rain hit the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in heavy rhythmic sheets, blurring the city skyline into a smear of grey and slate. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick, charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Nadia set her coffee mug down. The click of the ceramic against the marble sounded unnaturally loud. She looked down at her hands. The calluses were still there. The bleach stains around her cuticles hadn't magically washed away in the expensive shower. She was still Nadia. And the man standing across from her was still a monster who destroyed lives with a phone call. "I need my clothes," she said, breaking the heavy silence. "My uniform. My trench coat." Darian didn't move. He watched her carefully. "They're in the laundry room. Leo had them cleaned last night." He paused. "You don't need the uniform anymore, Nadia." "I have a shift at the diner at 4, she replied, keeping her tone flat, practical. "And Tuesday is the downstairs floors at the estate." "You're not scrubbing my floors anymore," Darian said, his voice hardening. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an edict. Nadia's head snapped up. Her eyes flashed with sudden fierce pride. "I told you I am not your charity case. You think because you put a bandage on my foot and ruined a billionaire's day that I'm just going to move in here and be your kept woman. I earn my keep. I don't owe you anything. I never said you owed me." Darian shot back, stepping around the kitchen island. He invaded her space, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. He stopped just inches away, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, could smell the sharp tang of coffee on his breath. "And I would never insult you by treating you like charity." Nadia stood her ground, tilting her chin up to meet his glare. "Then what is this, Mr. Costa? Because I don't know the rules of this game." "There is no game," Darian said, his voice dropping into a low, raw register. "I watched you last night. I watched you navigate a shark tank without spilling a drop of blood. You have a spine made of iron and a mouth that could cut glass. You see things, you see the angles, the rot, the weakness in people. You saw through Arthur. You saw through Conrad." He leaned in closer, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back up to her eyes. "You see through me." Nadia's breath hitched. She couldn't deny it. She knew the violence he was capable of, but she also knew the surprising stark gentleness of his hands on her bleeding feet. She saw the contradiction, and it terrified her how much it pulled her in. "I need someone I can trust." Darian continued the admission, seemingly dragged out of him against his will. "In my organization, everyone smiles at me because they're terrified or because they want a piece of the pie. I am surrounded by yes-men and jackals. I need someone who isn't afraid to look me in the eye and tell me when I'm being a fool. I need someone who understands the dirt." He raised his hand. He didn't grab her. He just lightly ran the back of his knuckles down the side of her cheek. The contrast of his rough skin against her face made her shiver. "I don't want a maid, Nadia," he murmured. "I want a partner. Someone to manage the assets that require a cynical touch. You want to earn your keep fine. I'll triple your diner salary and you work for me." not on your knees with a sponge. In a chair across a desk, Nadia stared at him. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a descent into the underworld. He was offering her power. She looked at the city outside, battered by the rain. She thought about the mold in her apartment. She thought about the endless numbing ache in her lower back from hauling yellow buckets of dirty water. And then she looked back at Darian Costa, a man composed entirely of sharp edges who had just burned a small fortune to the ground simply because someone had spoken down to her. She didn't smile. She didn't throw her arms around his neck. That wasn't who she was. No more lemon polish, she said, her voice steady, negotiating her terms. Darian's eyes darkened with a sudden intense heat. A slow, dangerous smirk finally broke through his stoic mask. No more lemon polish. I keep my apartment until I find a place I can pay for myself, she added, refusing to yield the high ground. Agreed. And if you ever try to use me as a punchline again, Nadia said, taking a half step forward, closing the final inch of space between them until her chest brushed against his. I will take that sledgehammer to your glass house, Darian. Darian didn't flinch. He reached up his hand, tangling in the messy hair at the base of her neck, his grip firm, possessive, and entirely inevitable. I'm counting on it, he breathed. He closed the distance, his mouth crashing down on hers. It wasn't a gentle romantic kiss. It was an absolute collision. It tasted like bitter coffee, lingering adrenaline, and the violent clash of two worlds colliding. Nadia grabbed the fabric of his shirt, her fists clenching tight, anchoring herself in the storm. She kissed him back with all the pent-up frustration, anger, and starved hunger of a woman who had finally stepped out of the background and into the fire. The gala was over. The joke was dead. But the real game had just begun.